appreciate everyone being here today, and we thought, pulling together sort of a global team, local team here from Europe, but as well as our perspectives in other parts of the world too, and certainly hearing your perspectives will be valuable in this discussion as well. So the way we want to kick things off today in this first session is talk about the future of digital transformation and just sort of where in general is the industry headed and what some of the things that we're seeing in the space, and what are some of the things to be aware of or thinking about as you navigate some of these digital transformations. And then that'll sort of lead us into the next session, which is the digital strategy piece. How can we define a roadmap and strategy? So just a quick overview of Third Stage Consulting. I think you all know this, but we're 100% technology independent and agnostic, so we are not affiliated with any software vendors. And that is what gives us the luxury of being able to openly discuss the good, the bad, the ugly about digital transformations. We tend to focus on digital transformation from more of a business perspective. Yes, we have technologists on our team, and yes, we understand technology very well, but we tend to lead with the business aspects of what our clients' needs are and how transformation can fit within that. We're based in the United States, but we have an office based here in London, as well as an office in Brisbane, Australia, that handles all of the Asia Pacific region, and the office here handles all of Europe, as well as at times Africa and Middle East as well, though we don't have a huge presence in those two regions, but primarily Western Europe is where we focus our efforts here out of the UK. The name Third Stage is actually a metaphor for rocket launch. It's a play on the concept of a rocket launch where you're fighting gravity and inertia and you're trying to get something up to its final destination. And what we found is that just like a rocket launch where you've got gravity and inertia and other forces that you're fighting, it's a dangerous mission. And a lot of companies don't succeed in reaching that third stage of success. And so when we look at what does it take to be successful, we want to help clients reach that third stage of success. Not to suggest that it's easy and that if you just hire third stage as a consulting firm, you're going to magically reach that third stage. But we want to apply and help our clients apply best practices to help them get to that third stage. And most organizations get stuck somewhere in the first or second stage. First stage is, if you can't get out of the first stage, that's basically suggesting that it's a failure. You never got anything off the ground, it didn't really launch, or it was an unmitigated disaster somewhere along the way. Quite frankly, most organizations don't experience massive failures that are showstoppers. I mean, we do have those, and we do quite a bit of expert witness work involving failures and lawsuits, but I would say that's a small subset of the entire industry. The bigger challenge is in some ways riskier because it's not as dramatic. Sometimes they fly under the radar, which is companies that get stuck in the second stage. And I'd say probably 80% of organizations get stuck in that second stage. And what that suggests is that in that second stage, they are going live with new technologies, but the go live itself and the use and the value behind that technology is not ideal. It's not at all close to what it should be. So in other words, organizations are spending too much time, too much money, and more than expected for lower business value than they should be achieving. So that's what we try to do, is help clients understand what does it take to get to that third stage. And it's not rocket science, despite the rocket metaphor. It is not rocket science. So there are some basic principles that organizations tend to overlook, and we talked about one already, which is change management. Let's just have a change person come in for a couple days a week, and they'll just deal with that whole pesky human people thing. That right there is an example of you will get stuck. Probably in the first stage, maybe you get to the second stage, but you will not reach the third stage if that is the approach you take. And I say that fairly universally and broadly, that I think that applies to most organizations. I don't know of an organization where, I can't give you an example of an organization we've worked with where they didn't really have to worry that much about change management. It wasn't that big of a deal. But a lot of executives think that. They think, well, okay, other companies have that problem. You all have that problem, but we're not going to have that problem because we're different. And our people are excited about change and that sort of thing. So that's really what the third stage metaphor is how can we avoid some of those pitfalls and help us reach that higher degree of success. And it's also, if you weren't familiar or weren't aware, I actually stole that metaphor from a rock band called Boston. They're from the late 70s and early 80s, an American band out of Boston. And they had an album, their third album was called Third Stage. So that's really where I stole the idea from, was from rock and roll. So some of the service offerings we provide, which we've coined mission control to go with the whole rocket launch metaphor. Some of the services we provide range from digital strategy and software selection, so organizations that are early in the planning phases of trying to figure out what their transformation is going to be. But we also do quite a bit of work in implementation. That's where most of our business comes from, is that the actual implementation as far as program management, organizational change management, as well as process improvement. And we also have a practice that does expert witness work too, and that's about 15% of our revenue, which is bigger than I would have thought for a company our size. The 15% of our revenue is coming from expert witness engagements, where we're basically doing analysis and testimony for courts and lawyers involving lawsuits throughout the world. And the reason I bring up sort of that full spectrum of work and experience that we have, beginning with digital strategy all the way through implementation, post-implementation, as well as failures and expert witness work, is because we just have a broad base of experience to draw from. And what we're trying to do with the expert witness practice is make sure that our clients in the other parts of our business don't ever need our expert witness services. So we're trying to minimize our expert witness revenue and make sure that clients are doing more of that work correctly up front. And what we found too, and we do a fair amount of project remediation too. That's actually the fastest growing part of our business, is projects that are already underway. They've already selected the software, they've already started an implementation, but they've struggled or failed, and they hire us to come in and fix it. That's the highest growth part of our business, and that's a big part of our revenue, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. But one thing we find is that we're trying to do more to make sure that, especially the clients that hire us from the start, we want to make sure they don't make the same mistakes as the clients that are hiring us after the fact. Digital transformations a lot of times remind me of being a parent at times. If any of you who has kids in the room, children, okay, a lot of you do. So you know how you tell your kid, don't touch the stove, or don't do something that you know is going to lead to something bad, but oftentimes you have to let them. They're just going to do it anyway, and then they won't do it again once they've made the mistakes themselves. A lot of times organizations are like that too. They can hear this stuff all day and it makes sense, but when it comes time to execute, they end up having to make the mistake, and then they end up hiring a company like us to come fix it. Oftentimes clients will hire us up front for the initial piece of consulting, and then they decide, we can do a lot of this ourselves, or we don't need to do a lot of the stuff you're suggesting, we'll be fine, and then they end up rehiring us later to come back and fix things that would have been a lot cheaper just to do right the first time. So that's how organizational behavior tends to work, for better or for worse, is a lot of times they have to experience the pain in order to know what to do. So a full suite of service offering that we provide here within our mission control framework. And we work with a lot of different clients. This is a partial representation of some of the clients we work with, and I know we have clients in the room as well. But a lot of our business is in the world of manufacturing and distribution, but also financial services, professional services, government, public sector, healthcare. Yes, yeah, a lot of different industries. Construction, a lot of engineer to order and make to order types of organizations as well. I'd say a little over half of our business is in manufacturing and distribution, and then the other half is in all other types of industries. So we're pretty neutral and agnostic in the industry side of things as well. So we're industry agnostic, tech agnostic, geographically agnostic, and that's a little bit about some of our clients. So most of our clients are upper mid-market organizations they're not small, but usually they're not Fortune 100 companies, although we do have Fortune 100 clients as well. Most of them are somewhere in the middle, kind of the upper mid-market there. So let's talk about the evolution of digital transformation in ERP software. It's interesting because I've been in the space for 25 years, and so much has changed in the world of technology, and technology, in my opinion, is sort of on a hockey stick acceleration of change, which is directly causing a massive amount of change to organizations that are implementing technology. So there's a lot of change happening in the world of digital transformation, but at the same time, some things haven't changed at all. There's certain core things that you wonder, how is it that everything with technology and organizations is changing so much, but the organizational behavior and the way organizations are treating their digital transformations hasn't kept up with the pace of change? And some of the things that we think about when we're looking at helping a client through digital transformation is, first of all, what is digital transformation? And again, this is where our unbiased view of the market comes in handy, because we're not here to tell you that your digital transformation needs to involve ERP software or best of breed or middleware or a custom developed solution, I can't tell you what digital transformation means to you universally. I have to know and understand each of you individually and your organizations individually to be able to align a strategy that fits with those needs. And so when you look at the technological options in the marketplace, it's just been a proliferation of options in terms of the types of technologies that are available. Back when I started, the one thing that changed or has changed in 25 years is that ERP software back then was sort of like the one answer you had. You're basically going to implement an ERP system. It's just a matter of how you implement it and which vendor you use and that sort of thing. Now, that's only one option. Now you have other best-of-breed options with HCM and CRM sorts of solutions. You also have other types of technologies, emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and Internet of Things, Industry 4.0, just to name a few. In some cases, those capabilities are becoming part of ERP, and ERP vendors are out acquiring and developing some of those capabilities themselves. But in other cases, those are standalone options. And so what it's done is not only given you more categorical options for your digital transformation, but within each of these categories, you also now have a huge assortment and array of software vendors available as well. So the key here is to not get overwhelmed by this, but to say, let's figure out first what it is we want to be when we grow up, what it is we're trying to accomplish, and then figure out from this menu of options what type of technology might best help us get there, and within that type of technology, what specific vendor or vendors are going to help us best complete that process as well. It's amazing to me, all these years of doing this work, I still get asked the question of what's your favorite software vendor? You have to have one, you just don't want to say it out loud. Just tell me off the record who your favorite software vendor is, and I can't tell you, I really can't. I don't have like a strong preference or even 2 or 3 that I just really like. I can tell you software vendors that I think are doing a great job of, disrupting the market and creating a good alternative to what's been out there. I think there's some great options like that, but it could be that those options that I like are just a terrible fit for you. And so that's why I hesitate to ever say that I have, preferences or that any of us have preferences. Instead, what I always ask is, well, I can tell you the pros and cons of any option you give me. You want to talk about SAP or Oracle or NetSuite? We were talking about Infor earlier today as well. We could talk all day about pros and cons. That's what we do well, is just to understand those pros and cons, and that's really what I always challenge clients to do too, is, you want to understand the positives of where you're going, but you also want to poke holes in it to say, okay, this is our direction we're going to go in terms of the type of technology and the vendors. Now let's talk about what the risks are, like where are the gaps and what are the deficiencies of that strategy, because no matter what strategy or specific selection or specific software you're going to deploy, there are trade-offs that you're making. There's some dark side that you have to address, and if you don't think there's a dark side, it doesn't mean that there is no dark side, it means you just don't know what it is yet. And so that's a big part of it too, is just understanding that let's pick the best path forward, but then once we pick that path forward, let's also understand what the dark side is so that we can mitigate those risks and make sure that we avoid some of the common challenges that organizations. So this shifts gears. I have a handful of things that I think are going to happen and become evident or are becoming evident within the transformation space. And I apologize, sometimes when I read this text, I present this stuff a lot in a lot of different groups. Sometimes I feel like maybe it's a little bit too strong or a little bit too strong a language, but sometimes that's more effective to get to the point. But one of the things that I think is happening and will continue to happen in this space is that the dark side of cloud technologies will be exposed. And I'm not disputing that the market is going towards cloud, because that ship has sailed, whether you like it or not. The industry is moving toward the cloud. That's not up for debate necessarily, I don't think. But what is up for debate is the downside and the trade-offs of cloud. I think people are really excited about the opportunities with cloud, and cloud does provide a huge amount of upside potential. But I think what it's also doing is introducing organizations to new types of risk that they weren't prepared for, or perhaps haven't been experienced in overcoming in the past. One of which is a lot of solutions that started off on-prem but are now moving to the cloud. There's a lot of deficiencies and immaturity gaps in those products. And yes, cloud might be the best option longer term, but in the short term, what it's doing is creating gaps and deficiencies that organizations aren't prepared for. We have one client that's implementing, it's a big steel company in the United States, and they're implementing Oracle EBS. And right in the middle, it's a 7-year implementation. It's our it's I believe our single biggest client in terms of size of the organization. But they're about 4 to 5 years, I think, in the middle of that 7-year journey. And right in the middle of it, Oracle came to them and said, hey, EBS is on-prem. You should really think about switching now to Oracle Cloud. And we already know that Oracle sales reps are heavily commissioned to sell cloud solutions, so they got a lot of pressure to switch to the cloud. And they actually seriously considered it. We helped them through the evaluation to determine that the cloud solution for a complex manufacturer just wasn't ready, or it just wasn't mature enough for their needs. So they said, no, we appreciate it, but we're going to stay on-prem for the foreseeable future until we know that there's a solution in the cloud that helps us accomplish what we need. And that's okay. I think a lot of times in the industry we think, oh, it's not in the cloud, it's on-prem. Oh, that's terrible. You're going to go out of business. You know, that's the message that you oftentimes hear from the industry. But I think it's just something to recognize that you're probably going to have deficiencies and gaps in any sort of cloud solution you deploy, especially if it's a legacy vendor. It's not as true for like a NetSuite, because NetSuite was built in the cloud, so it's already reached a higher level of maturity compared to others or other cloud solutions. But it's just something to be aware of. The other thing too, another example of how the dark side will be exposed is if you set aside business value, business benefits for a moment, which is very important. So I don't mean permanently set it aside, but just set it aside for a moment and just look at the cost side of the equation. Generally speaking, we find that cloud solutions are going to cost more longer term because you have the ongoing subscription fees, the maintenance, or the subscriptions don't go away. Software vendors, if they were in the room, would probably say, no, that's not true because you're going to save a lot of money and here's all the business value. Yes, there is business value, and the net effect might be that it's overall a better ROI in the cloud, but a lot of times organizations underestimate the cost that goes along with it. And a lot of CFOs tend to get frustrated over time when they realize, oh, instead of one big capital investment that we depreciate over time, now we have this ongoing OpEx cost that just never goes away. In fact, it increases over time. So again, it's not to say don't go to the cloud because you're going to spend too much money. It's to say you're going to spend more money, and let's make sure that you're getting the business value to justify that additional cost. Another thing is increased accountability and risk mitigation. I think organizations are starting to get smarter and a little bit more self-aware of what the risks are. I think organizations are starting to take more ownership and accountability for their own success. And sometimes I feel like we're motivational speakers because we have to convince clients a lot of times like, hey, this is your project. It's not our project. It's not a software vendor. It's you. You are going to decide whether or not this is successful. You can bring in the right partners to help you, and if things don't go the way you want them to, you make the change. And a lot of times I think organizations don't have the confidence and the knowledge to be able to think that way. A lot of times what happens, a dynamic that we see that I think is very interesting is that big software vendor, big system integrator comes in, they're the experts, and they will tell you how this project should go, and you're not going to ask a lot of questions because you don't necessarily know any better. You don't have a better alternative, better option. And that dynamic is super unhealthy, and it creates this sort of learned helplessness from the organizations that are going through the project. They end up with an open checkbook, spending all this time and money on a project that isn't going well, but the problem is they don't always know what to do, like what's the best option. That same steel company I was talking about in the United States is one of the more unique clients that I've ever worked with, because what they did is they were working with Capgemini as their system integrator, and they ended up scaling back the contract with Capgemini, which is unheard of. That's blasphemy, you know, to go to an Accenture or Deloitte or Capgemini and say, hey, guess what? I know you've got 50 people on this project, but we're going to cut that in half. You're going to get a lot of pushback from your vendor if you try to do that, because it harms them economically, and therefore they're going to convince you that that's not the right path forward. But the answer isn't, is that the right thing for your system integrator? The question should be, is it the right thing for you? And so organizations just taking ownership and having that buy-in and accountability and that the leadership behind it, that's what's lacking a lot of times. And a lot of times it's because it starts at the top. The executives say, hey, you're the project manager, go do this, go figure it out. And there's not that clear vision from the top of what the project should look like and how it's going to be managed and what the project governance is going to be. And that's a big part of what we'll talk about in implementation readiness here in a little bit, is what are those things you can be doing to take control of the project, to give yourselves the framework and the foundation to be able to manage the project going forward, so that you are managing the project and you're not being managed. Because at the end of the day, this goes for third stage too. Third stage and other consultants go away at some point. They should go away. You're going to be the ones left with whatever is left, and you're the one that has to be accountable during the project as well. So that's a big part of what we're finding, is that organizations are slowly starting to accept responsibility and take more ownership of the projects. It's still not anywhere close to where it needs to be, but we are starting to see more of that in the market. Organizational change and human capital management are minimum investments in technology initiatives. It's amazing to me how much money organizations will spend on technology, and then they totally skimp on the change management. And I always tell clients too, if you're going to overinvest in something or feel like you're at risk of overinvesting in something, try change management instead of technology. Chances are pretty high you're going to be a lot more successful. You may not get all the bells and whistles you want, but at least you know what you do implement is going to be a lot more successful. The other thing is, change management and this stuff here is not nearly as expensive and risky in some ways if you do it right. If you're investing in this stuff, that's a lot less costly than investing all this time and money in technology without change management. So it's more than just an insurance policy too. It's more, maximizing value and ensuring that you aren't experiencing operational disruption, for example. That's something that organizations don't think about. They think about the cost of the implementation itself, just the project cost. They think about the potential business value longer term, but they don't think about that middle part, which is what happens if you can't ship product? What happens if it's one of the disasters that Christina was talking about early on? What does that cost you if you can't ship product for 30 days? There's a real cost there that organizations don't think about. Or what happens if you can't run payroll for a couple cycles? It's a pretty big deal. You're gonna have regulatory issues. You're gonna have a lot of pissed off employees and that sort of thing. So it's really understanding that there is a cost associated with this, but the cost of not doing this stuff is a lot greater typically. We talked a little bit about this in the opening slide as well as even in the pre-discussion, but best of breed and interoperability will become more relevant, and it is becoming more relevant. And there's still cases where single, unified, integrated, monolithic ERP systems are the right answer, or it's a right answer within a subset of more answers. But more organizations now, and what we're finding with our clients is there's a lot of best of breed options out there that could be good options. Now again, if I were to get NetSuite in the room or SAP or anyone like that, they're probably gonna say, no. Best of breed is dead. You need one single source of truth, one ERP system, all the same sales messaging that's been out there for 25 plus years. But the key is understanding, again, there's a trade-off here. Best of breed has definite trade-offs, but there's a definite upside too. So it's a matter of looking at two scenarios. If we do, say, a single ERP system, what is the cost benefit and the risk profile of that versus if we do some sort of best of breed approach? You could add other options too, even custom solutions. I know that's frowned upon in the industry because there's so many commercial off-the-shelf options. But there are cases, and a lot of times there's isolated cases within a lot of organizations where it makes sense to do some sort of custom solution because it's a core competitive differentiator, competitive advantage. It's so unique and so important to the business that you need something that an off-the-shelf system can't do. That's not the end of the world if you do a custom solution. There are risks, of course, but there could be potential business value benefits to that as well. So really just understanding those options and understanding that there are more options than ever per the previous slide we mentioned too. There is an increase in transformation failures, and part of that is we're seeing in terms of the growth of our expert witness practice and the project recovery part of our business. But it's also, if you just look at the dynamics in what's happening in the industry right now, there are a lot of things that are creating a perfect storm of digital transformation failure. In fact, a video that just went live this week on my YouTube channel dives into this in about 12 minutes. I talk about all the different dynamics that are happening in the space, so I'll try to summarize a couple of them. But a few things that are happening that are causing an increase in failures right now is, yes, technology is getting more advanced and there's more potential behind it. But what's also happening is that you have software vendors that are forcing upgrades through sunsetting their legacy products and moving clients in mass to cloud solutions. So you have a lot of companies that are going through digital transformation right now, whether they like it or not, whether they're ready or not, they're going through it because they're in some ways being forced to. At the same time, you have technical skills that are somewhat of a bottleneck. There's not enough technical skills to keep up with that demand that's being artificially created by the vendors who are trying to sunset you into new solutions. The general gist of it is that, one other one is Agile. You mentioned Agile earlier. The Agile movement is creating a lot of problems with digital transformation because there's nothing wrong with Agile, but when you take it too far, it undermines some of the structure and sequential discipline that Waterfall provides, and that's creating challenges as well. And so you add up all these things that are happening all at once in the industry, and it's creating a perfect storm of transformation failure. And there are ways around it, and that's the same things that I would have said 10 or 20 years ago. It's the same way to navigate those challenges. But the key is to recognize that the failure rates are higher, and we're seeing an increase in failures in troubled projects, partly because of all those things that are happening in the market all at once. And if you want more analysis, my video goes into more detail on that as well. Another thing is that this is more of a, I guess I'd call it more of a Tony Robbins moment. If you know who Tony Robbins is, the motivational speaker, is to, as I mentioned before, part of our job is to motivate and help people have confidence to, this is your project, you can be better. And if I had the raspy, cool voice, and if I was taller, like to your point, I'm a lot shorter than I'm.
Yeah, but you've got the same smile. You've got Tony Robbins' smile.
He's a good-looking guy, so I'll take it as a compliment. But this is where customers have to recognize that you have all the leverage. I mean, really, it is your project, and you need to make the decisions that are right for your business, regardless of what the industry trends are, or what industry analysts or consultants tell you. You can listen, of course, but it's more important to recognize what it is you're trying to accomplish and really protect your interests, because I think that's something that's sorely lacking in the space, and I think ultimately it will be a downfall of the industry that will, I think, eventually lead to regulation. Back to Christina's point earlier, is that there's so much self-interest in the space that's harming organizations that are going through these transformations that eventually it's going to come to a head. And but in the meantime, until there's some sort of formal mandate for organizations to do things a certain way, you have to do what's right for your business and make sure that you're managing the project effectively.
It's quite tricky with an Oracle or an SAP. They have quite a lot of power. They have very rigid roadmaps. We're back into the customization discussion. Once you've made a choice of which vendor you're going for, you almost need to just follow their roadmap almost no matter what. And you might need to add some elements on the side, do it on smaller platforms to enhance what they've got, but you're pretty much stuck with what they're delivering.
Right. Yeah, unless you...
So your leverage at that stage is, or the client's leverage is constrained, isn't it?
In some ways, if you've put all your eggs in one basket like an Oracle, then yes, that puts more leverage in their bucket. But that's where best of breed sometimes can help, is you're mitigating and hedging the risk a bit. Certainly when it comes to implementation too, you don't necessarily need to hire one big system integrator that's going to do everything for you, because then you've really shifted the leverage to that party. We have some clients that intentionally will have multiple parties involved in the project, which can be chaotic and it can create other problems, but they do it because they don't want to have sole dependency or too much dependency on one third party, and so they intentionally try to mitigate that risk that way. So there still are ways around that. I think you're right. Oracle's going to do what it's going to do regardless of what you think about it, and you're either going to go along with it or you're not. The key is, what do you do if you don't go along with it? Could you find another option? Could you do a bolt-on, or could you say, well, we're going to let that ship sail on your roadmap, but we're not going to be a part of it, and we're going to stick, if we can we stick with whatever functionality or version we're on? Those are all easier said than done types of questions, but questions that can be answered or should be answered deliberately going forward, rather than just deferring to whatever the vendor thinks is the right thing for their customers.
Even if you're moving to a new system, if you're starting with what is going to become, and Logan, I'm going to defer to you a little bit on this, but a greenfield opportunity for a new ERP and enterprise operations system, you're still going to have to maintain the current system that you're on. Whatever legacy system that is, whatever interfaces to other systems is going on. And that requires a certain set of skills that may not come with, especially your systems integrator of choice that's going to be doing the implementation work. So there are always multiple partners, multiple parties to manage in that. And that's the overarching program that we're going to be talking about a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. So it's not the project itself, it's the entire continuum of how do we move off of a legacy system onto a new system, what are the right resources to do that all the way along. That's really your responsibility, our responsibility in terms of the organization moving forward under this.
Right.
So.
And then the last point for this is that strategy is still important. So strategy and defining that roadmap, and to your point, making sure you've got not only the right solution or solutions defined, but also, more importantly, how are you going to deploy those solutions? And what is that going to look like? And how's it going to support your broader, bigger picture business strategy and objectives? That's the most important thing, and that's what we'll talk about next in the next session. So it's sort of a segue into the digital strategy discussion. So we'll dive into that in more detail, so I won't spend a lot of time now. But before we'll take a quick break and then get into the digital strategy and roadmap piece of it. Any questions or thoughts on this opening segment before we dive into more detail in the next one? We're going to shift gears now and talk about digital strategy. So defining digital strategy and roadmap, this sort of leads into the implementation readiness piece of it that we'll talk about as well. You know, one thing that we've talked about, or a theme that's come up in the conversation so far, is this whole concept of, you know, choosing the right technology and making sure you've got the right technology, and comparing that importance of selecting the right technology versus implementing it really well and making sure that you've got the right strategy and direction and roadmap. And one of the biggest challenges we see with clients is it's not that the technology is broken or even that the strategy itself is broken, but the bigger problem is that the strategy that's being deployed doesn't fit the overall strategy of the company. And this, again, comes back to the point I made earlier, which is when clients ask, you know, what's your favorite ERP system or what's your favorite technology? I don't have a good answer because I don't know. You tell me what you're looking for, and then I'll tell you what, you know, might be the best options there. The same is true for digital strategy. There is no one type of strategy that we can say definitively is more effective than another. But what we can say definitively is that the strategies that are aligned are going to be more successful, regardless of what the strategy is. If it's aligned and the organization has a digital strategy that fits who they are and where they're trying to be, where they're trying to go, those strategies are generally going to be a lot more effective than otherwise. So that's really what we focus on here today in this session, is talking about how do we define a digital strategy that is aligned and fits with who it is you are as an organization and what it is you're trying to accomplish. So we can just jump right into it. So now we've gone from pretty high level talking to now a really detailed, hard to read slide that has almost too much detail on it. But I'm not going to go through each of these boxes because I could easily, and trust me when I say this, I don't want to have to prove it. I could easily spend 2 hours on this one slide, but I'm not going to. So you're welcome for that in advance.
I've seen him do it before, in case anybody's wondering.
Yeah. I could talk about one slide all day, no matter what it is. But these are the sort of the major components of digital strategy, and really we just want to show you this and talk through it a bit to help understand, you know, what is a digital strategy? What does that mean? And actually there's a couple slides after this or later in this presentation that dive into a little bit more detail of how we make some of the decisions within these boxes here. But generally speaking, we want to chat through what some of the major work streams and considerations are for defining what your digital strategy is. And if I were to summarize before we dive into it, if I were to summarize what this is not, what a digital strategy is not, is just defining on technology, or just defining what the technology strategy is. That is a component of it, but as you'll see as we talk through this, more of this has to do with people and process and general strategy than it has to do with technology. Technology ends up being just one component of the overarching strategy that's going to be deployed. So if we look at these, I'll just sort of walk through the 6 major work streams without talking about each box within them or each chevron. But the first is business process management, and that's an important input and output from a digital strategy roadmap. The input being understanding what the current state processes are, because that is important to understand where you are today, as we mentioned earlier, or as we discussed earlier. Understanding what the current state processes are, what the strengths of those current processes are, and where the weaknesses and opportunities are is critically important. And part of that is because we need to not only have a clear vision of where we're headed and what the future state processes are going to be, and ensuring that we have a strategy that supports that, but also understanding what the gap is between the current state and the future state. So understanding where we are today, where we're headed in the future, that's a big part of it, because if we think about from a change management perspective, as we'll get to later, the magnitude of change is really important, and how big of a change our processes are going to change, or how big of a transformation those processes are, will materially affect the overall roadmap in terms of the implementation plan and strategy. So we have to understand where we are today, where we're headed in the future, what the magnitude of change is, and it also gives us focus and clarity on how we're going to manage the project. So the better definition we've done on business process management, the better governance we have around making decisions related to the project, because you think about all the different decisions that have to be made that are material project decisions around scope, modules that we're going to deploy, or when we're going to deploy certain modules, whether or not we're going to buy that third-party bolt-on that could maybe do a better job than what we've got in our core system, or whether or not we're going to customize the software versus configure the software. all those major decisions can become pretty arbitrary and almost like shooting in the dark if we don't have clarity on what our business processes are going to be and where the real business value is. So that's why the business process piece is so important, is it really serves as that sort of a blueprint for what the overall transformation and the strategy is going to be.
This is also where we really develop the business plan, the business model that you're going to be taking both to the executive team as well as to anybody who's going to be working in the organization in the beginning stages of organizational change, right? So it's getting everybody on the same bandwagon to understand these are going to be the advantages that we're going to have in the future state, and this is the gaps that we're filling from the current state. So unlike some of the agile implementations where you're just implementing new software and you only care about the future state, you really need to back up and understand, how is this going to benefit the organization? What does our plan look like over the next 5 years to achieve the things that we're setting out as our business model? And then getting the whole organization aligned with that and getting the expenditure put together that is going forward. So,
yeah, and really defining the overall business case and understanding the business value that comes out of that work stream. And then change management, understanding it's not a question of if this is going to be a significant change, because it is. It's going to be a significant change to the organization, and that is a one universal truth, even if it's a relatively small or minor upgrade or incremental change or incremental improvement to your business. It's still probably a greater change than your organization fully realizes. So the question isn't, is this going to be significant change? Is change management going to be difficult? Do we need to focus on change management? Do we need to have a change management plan? That's all. It should be a foregone conclusion that yes, it is going to be difficult. You need to focus on change management. But now, instead of just saying, well, let's just get some people ProSci certified, get them to learn ADCAR and go throw them on the project, we need to be a little bit more prescriptive than that and say, well, let's understand what exactly the changes are and what the general strategy is. And also, let's back up and look at what our culture is today and who we are as an organization today, strengths and weaknesses, because that's going to influence how we approach change management. Just as a quick example, if you're an organization that has grown through acquisition, gone out and acquired other companies, and now you're trying to integrate the operations and you're trying to standardize functions and standardize processes, but the companies you've acquired were very entrepreneurial, they're very nimble, and that's part of why they were so valuable as an acquisition target. Now you're talking about a cultural clash there. And so really having a deliberate view of what is our strategy from a change perspective of what we want the culture to be, that's really important. And a lot of times organizations say, well, we're just going to create a culture of digital innovation. I can't tell you what that means. That's a buzzword that we consultants created that don't have a lot of substance behind it. So that's a big part of the challenge is ensuring that we have clarity around what the changes are and what the culture today is going to be and what it's going to be in the future. So that's a big part of it. So doing an organizational assessment up front is one of the core fundamental aspects of doing change management or starting change management during your digital strategy. And one thing I'll say is that I have yet to meet an organization or a client that says to us, like, hey, third stage, you did a great job on the change management stuff, but you know what, we spent way too much time and effort on change management. We should have done less change management. I have yet to meet that client that says, I wish we would have done less change management on that project. Then we really would have nailed it or hit a home run or whatever the case may be. I'll try to avoid the American sports metaphors there, but I apologize for that. So that organizational assessment is a key part of it, is really just understanding what the current state is and where you're headed. And then also the organizational impact and really understanding what does this change mean in general. We may not have yet defined a super detailed implementation plan yet. That comes next, and that's part of what we'll talk about in the next session. But we can start to define where are the major changes in the organization going to be. For example, back to the example of a global company that's gone out and acquired multiple entities and now they're trying to act like one global company, what is that going to mean at a high level to the organization? It could mean that our accounting and finance group is going to be materially affected. That's a big change because now we're going to move to a shared service model, and that's our vision, is shared service, consolidated, single accounting and finance department. How is that going to affect that group, and what are some of the major changes, and how might we start to think about our change strategy for those groups knowing that as we go through the project, we're going to define those change impacts in a lot more detail, but we can at least start to paint that vision and understanding of where those changes are. And guess what? That change management piece, the change impact, that is on the critical path, because if we don't understand what those impacts are and how long it's going to take to get to that future state organizationally, it doesn't matter how fast we do the technical stuff down below. Chances are pretty high that the technology pieces are going to be compressed, or they could be compressed to be done a lot faster than it's going to take to change the organization. And that's the problem that organizations have, is they have a technical implementation plan that looks like this, but they're not accounting for the fact that the change itself is going to take this long. And so they're budgeting and putting together a plan that looks like this, but in reality, it was going to take this long and this much budget to get through the transformation. Yes, you can define a completely new culture, but getting there, culture doesn't happen, good or bad. The good and bad parts of culture don't happen easily or in a short time frame. In fact, the time it's going to take to change your culture is going to far exceed any sort of reasonable transformation plan, assuming you've boxed it in. And now, granted, some might argue, well, life is a transformation. We're always transforming. We're always changing, of course. But if we're saying we've got a 3-year plan to transform our business, you're going to move the needle on the culture, but you're not going to get to that future state fully. But the key is to understand what that future state is so that we can start bending the needle and moving that direction to get us closer there. And also recognizing that it's going to take years and years to change the culture the way we really want to, understanding that the cultural headwinds we have in place now are probably going to slow down any utopia focused plan that a vendor might give you. So a vendor says it's going to take you 18 months to deploy new technology. You might say, well, yeah, to deploy the technology, in these technology work streams here, that might be 18 months. But to change the culture and to change the organization, it's going to take a lot more than that. So we've got to figure out, reconcile that in some way.
It's a great point. And look, the culture is unique to your organization, right? Going through something like this, I would just point out, is before you've got a software vendor partner, it's before you've got a systems integrator partner, it's the organization itself with possibly an advisory partner, right? Getting into the organizational readiness to move forward with a new program is taking input from all areas of the organization, understanding what that looks like in order to affect the change. So that change management starts with really polling everyone throughout the organization, determining exactly how everyone is feeling about the organization, making decisions strategically about how they're going to move forward, if they've got confidence in that, how it's going to affect them individually, right? Because even though we're all about the organization, we're also all about our personal needs. And so this is really the beginning of that cultural shift, if you will, to a go-forward plan for the organization in terms of a digital transformation.
Their problems.
That's half. I totally agree, and that's half the battle. Or half the value of doing an organizational assessment is just the fact that you ask the end users. It doesn't even matter it does matter what they say, but of course. But I'm saying half the value is regardless of what they say. The fact that you just asked and got the input from the end users is important, because there's going to be so much counter messaging to that, which is, oh, we don't care what you do today because we've got best practices we're going to bring in with our standardized software we're about to roll out. That's going to create a lot of resistance if we do the latter. So doing what you said, just asking the question of what is it you do today, why do you do it, understanding that, it's going to help create buy-in, but it's also going to inform the project team so that when they define the digital strategy, they've considered all those things. And they've started to identify where the points of resistance are going to be, rather than saying, well, I don't care that you're going to resist the change because you're just going to do it because that's the way things are going to be. We have to understand those headwinds to know that this group here is going to resist change because it's a bigger change, or they take a lot of pride in what they're doing today, and this is going to automate a big part of what they've always done. And it may be the best thing for the business, but we have to understand that that's going to create challenge and resistance, and we've got to figure out and understand what that resistance is so that we can have a change strategy that mitigates it. And not only is it the users that are the source of the resistance, but then the mid-level management ends up becoming the face of the resistance. So then you have mid-managers who now have a lot more influence. Now they're pushing back and resisting upwards on behalf of the end users. And so if we don't start at the end user base, work our way back up on the resistance piece, it's going to be too much to overcome in many cases. In understanding the technology piece, which really are the next three boxes here, the next three rows, you have enterprise applications, which is sort of your traditional evaluation and selection of potential technologies. But even then, before you get into sending out RFPs and getting demos from software vendors, you really have to understand what type of technology is that you're looking for. Back to that very first slide that we discussed this morning, they had all the hodgepodge of different technologies with AI and ERP and CRM and that sort of thing. It's really just understanding what is it we're doing. Are we looking for a tier one big ERP system? Are we looking for a best of breed? Are we looking for an interoperability sort of model? Are we looking for emerging technologies like AI and machine learning and that sort of thing? Is it some combination of all the above? All that stuff we need to have a real clear vision on, and that clarity of vision comes from understanding the first two buckets, which are what is it that our processes are today, where we're headed, how is it we want to see the organization evolve, and even bigger picture than that, backing up even more, is looking at the strategy of the organization. What is it we are trying to do as a company, and what technology or technologies are going to best enable us to get there? And you're going to have different answers for different organizations, which is why it's highly ineffective to say there's one answer, and that is single ERP or standard off-the-shelf SaaS-based technologies. There is no one answer that's going to work for every organization. It depends on what the strategy is. We always joke internally about doing drinking games. About anytime you hear the word "it depends," we all take a shot. If it was later in the day, I might suggest that's a good idea, but may not be a good idea at this point. Back to the acquisition standardization example, maybe that's the executive vision, is that we're going to go acquire these companies. Now we're going to integrate into a standard global operational model with shared services. But then we get to the digital strategy and we go out and we start deploying different instances of the software in different parts of the world. Well, that's exactly what you're trying to get away from, is that, so that disconnect will inevitably create friction. Executives are going to not be happy no matter how it goes. If that digital strategy is misaligned with business strategy, executives will not be happy with the end result. In fact, so much so that generally what happens during the implementations that are disconnected is you end up spending so much time and money trying to fight those headwinds and fighting that misalignment with really no clear path to success other than make sure you get the project aligned. So I think that's the key, is to make sure you've got an aligned strategy. Even if the business strategy and or the digital strategy are not ideal, they're not perfect, as long as they're aligned, that's going to give you a lot more chances of success than if they're disconnected.
I think we do need one more chevron up here in organizational change management that just says drinking games. I mean, the unifying quality of drinking games.
The building morale and buy-in to the transformation. Right, exactly. Just one little bullet in there to see who's really paying attention. One little bullet, yeah. So looking at those strategic alternatives and understanding the enterprise application landscape and ultimately getting at least a starting point short list is generally a good output from digital strategy. A lot of times clients that hire us will start with just a long list at this point because they have so much lack of clarity around their general direction and strategy. But regardless, you want to have some direction by the time you've defined your digital strategy of what type of technology it is that you're going to be looking for and ultimately deploying. And then there's the solution architecture piece too, and really understanding how different technology or technologies are going to align with your current state and the future state going forward. So a lot of times organizations don't think about that architecture piece, which is, not only the technical architecture of how systems integrate, but also the business architecture of how the business processes are going to align and how everything's going to tie together, what the interim plans are for all these legacy systems that might go away. What are we going to do when there's a new system for part of the business, but where we still have legacy systems for other parts? Are we going to create interim integration? Are we going to allow or just live with manual workarounds and that sort of thing? That sort of clarity is really important, because if we don't understand that, then we're not going to have a realistic implementation plan when it comes time to define that. So understanding the architecture and the architectural impact is important. And it's also organizational too. Understanding what your IT department is going to look like in the future. That's really important, because we keep coming back to your example of 5,000 IT people, because you probably have the biggest IT group in the room here. And so it's a good example of how we have to define what those 5,000 people are going to be doing in the future, what they're going to be doing in the interim, and then what is that change plan to help get there. Because that's another point of either resistance, which oftentimes happens where the IT group will resist the change because it's going to be such a dramatic change to their day-to-day jobs, or it ends up becoming really expensive because we didn't consider the fact that we needed to bring the IT group along as well. So we have to have that organizational architecture defined too, just what is that future state of the organization. And then the BI and analytics piece, how are we gonna make sure that we don't just deploy technology that maybe it works fine, but now we can't get the visibility into day-to-day operations as we need or want to get from new technology. So having that clear vision, a clarity of what it is that's gonna allow us to get there. It could be that the enterprise apps that we've deployed are fine and it gives us the analytical tools we need and want, or it could mean that we need some sort of bolt-on, third-party BI tool, or like a Snowflake, for example, is a common tool that's pretty popular now, where it's working with other systems, or Palantir. Palantir, Snowflake are sort of two BI-ish sorts of options that allow you to take multiple systems and integrate. Companies have long used Power BI and other types of BI tools, Tableau and whatnot, to help take and get the most value out of the enterprise systems that they've just deployed, to make sure that they're getting data and visibility into the operations.
It's also a big part of your business case and your return on investment, right? Especially for your executive level people. They want to gain insights out of the organization in the way that it works as a full enterprise. And being able to unify all of those data sources. I mean, look, the organizations today, they have a haystack of data and information, right? We really shouldn't celebrate the fact that you've got a haystack of disparate information sources. We should really celebrate being able to find the needle in that haystack with an analytics system that works enterprise-wide.
So. Really believable to buy this to the management?
Well, in many cases, you can use basically benchmarking. So APQC, we use a lot to determine what a high-level return on investment should be, given best practices. But you also have to take the organization's own numbers into account. So if you've got disparate units, business units working globally that are doing their own thing, but nothing is funneling up to the corporate center entity, as an organization that you've got all sorts of business loss in terms of contracts, in terms of the procurement process, manufacturing process, delivery logistics, all of that information, if it's disparate and siloed, then you know that there's a huge return on being able to bring it into the center. So we have to analyze where are those sources in consolidation going to benefit, and how much does that equate to in terms of save time, save cost, contract management in terms of forced spend within contract parameters, that type of thing.
And then the last piece here too is the project quality assurance. So getting project governance in place and some of the risk mitigation controls, that's something that's important to do early on, partially because when we are defining this digital strategy and roadmap, typically we're looking at multiple alternatives or options. We're looking at the pros and cons of different paths we could take, and usually it's not 100% clear cut which path is the best for us. So we've got to look at sort of a risk-adjusted cost-benefit analysis of what the costs are for each of these different paths we could take, what the potential business value is, and what the risks are, and ultimately how are we going to manage that project longer term. And so getting that project quality assurance in place is something that you want to do, partly because the risks start to become very apparent, at least at the tip of the iceberg during this digital strategy piece. And then when you get into implementation planning as sort of a next phase, and you get into more detail, then more risks start to get exposed. And so we want to start getting in that mindset of getting that quality assurance in place and that risk mitigation profile or mechanism in place so that we can identify and manage those risks. And that's really a key thing here is when we're going through this exercise with clients, generally we're looking at 2 or 3 different scenarios. We've got 2 or 3 different strategies we could take. Just again, as that example of we could go with a single tier one cloud ERP system. That's one option. That's sort of one general path that's going to standardize our operations and potentially for that global organization that's trying to standardize through all their acquisitions that they're trying to integrate. In that case, it could be that that's the most costly path, but it could also mean that it has the highest business value, potential business value. And then the question becomes, are we willing to spend that much time and money, knowing that the risk is probably a little bit higher, but also knowing that there's a lot more business value there? Or do we go with a more incremental approach? Maybe one that it's not quite as expensive, it's not quite as risky, doesn't quite deliver as much business value as we want, but it's more realistic for who we are. Those are the kinds of questions you have to ask, and really painting the picture of what these paths might look like is really important from an executive buy-in perspective, because ultimately you need the executives to be on board with whatever path we take, and they need to understand the risks and the trade-offs that they're making. One of the stories I like to tell on a personal level is when I married my wife, she had 2 young kids. They were 2 years old and 5 years old. And actually, when we first started dating, they were even younger. But we were dating, and she was a single mom. I didn't have kids of my own. And then when we decided we were going to get married, I realized, wait, I'm going to be a dad too. So I should probably figure out that part of the whole thing. I was just expecting to date and marry her, but it took me a while to realize, like, I'm also going to be a dad. So I had no idea what I was doing, like a lot of us as parents. And so I went and read a book called Love and Logic. And it's a child psychology sort of book about how to raise kids and give them choices and consequences and options in life and that sort of thing. And one of the really fascinating things is not only did it help me sort of jump in cold to being a dad, but it also helped me a lot in consulting, because a lot of times I feel like that's how you have to be with executives. Not to treat children, 2-year-old children, to executives, but sometimes they act very similar, where they want the world, they want the earth, the moon, and the sun, and they don't want any sort of risk or cost to go along with that. And so we take a lot of that sort of love and logic mentality with child raising, whereas you kind of have to sit down with the executives and say, I know you want that perfect solution that's 100% mitigating risk and it's 100% aligned with what you want, but you have to make a decision. It's not going to be perfect, it's not going to be pretty, but you have to pick one. And usually it's a lot of, yeah, but I want that tier one ERP solution and I don't want all the risk to go along with it. And I don't want to do any customization, but yet I don't want to invest in change management either. That's impossible. So you have to pick one. Either you're going to allow customization, for example, or you're going to spend more time investing more time and money on change management. So it's just little things like that you have to make sure that you kind of treat executives that way, or force decision making in that kind of a way. So has anyone read that book, Love and Logic, by the way, or familiar with the concepts behind it? It's really good. I actually highly recommend it for transformations, because it gets inside the mind of a child, and I think a lot of that applies to like organizational immaturity and organizational growth and things like that. So that was not the intent of the book, I don't think, but I made it the intent for me
Love your
personally.
analogy, though. And I know from knowing your kids that this is a very effective consulting route to go to.
Yeah, my poor kids, they get so many, before I give them any sort of answer, I ask a lot of questions. Well, let me first understand, what is it you're trying to accomplish? You want to go outside and play? Well, look, tell me why. Why is that? So any questions on this general framework? I know it's a lot, and we've got actually a lot of other content behind this that we won't get into today, but it sort of unpacks each of these work streams. But really just wanted to paint the picture of what are the major things we should be thinking about as we define digital strategy, and then that leads us into implementation readiness.
How many versions are there in the last 20 years?
Of this right here? Honestly, I mean, this iteration was probably 2 or 3 years ago, and it continues to evolve a little bit, but I'd say the major work streams and things that should be thought about, for the most part, I would say you could have applied the same thing 20 or 30 years ago too, and I hope that you can apply this in 10 or 20 years, because it is pretty independent or agnostic, other than maybe the BI and analytics piece. That one's a little bit different. That one's a more recent one that wasn't as important 20 years ago. And who knows, it might change a little bit. I imagine it'll probably change a bit in the future as well. But I think it's something that stands the test of time and technology too, because it's meant to be something that you could use whether you already know you're going to do a big SAP S/4HANA implementation, or if you're just starting out and you don't know, or you're going to go with a smaller best of breed route. This same framework and mindset applies to any of those scenarios. It's just a matter of molding this and shaping it to fit whatever it is you're trying to do.
Again, the majority of this happens before you choose a software vendor or a systems integrator. So this is, part of this is what we commonly refer to as phase 0. So it's before phase 1 and the implementation starts with a single software vendor or multiple software vendors, but it's something that the organization has to go through, right? So this is the advisory part of our business.
Right.
But it's what any organization needs to go through on their own.
How do I know that I follow the strategy or not?
That's where the next iterative phase of defining the implementation plan becomes important, and then of course the execution of that plan against the original plan. So it's the sequential sort of iterative approach where you want to make sure each step of the way you're staying aligned with what was done prior to that. And of course, things will evolve and change, and it may be deliberate that you're going to go off track here. We define the strategy in January, but then come June, we realize that there's some modifications we make. And that's okay as long as it's deliberate and not just lack of governance or lack of focus, because that's more often why organizations go off track, is because they have this vision or they have somewhat of a strategy and they don't execute it the right way. But I think the bigger challenge, though, is just not having this to begin with and just jumping straight into, let's go pick a software vendor and then let's go start implementing without having done this stuff. And this is really as much of a strategic framework as it is a project governance framework, too, to help make sure that you stay on track. Because if we know what the low-hanging fruit is and what the focus is of the project, it's going to make it a lot easier for team members to make decisions that align with that than if we haven't gone through this exercise. Be created in collaboration with the project manager and the project team. So in other words, it generally, in at least the clients we work with, we don't come in and just talk to the executives and then hand it over to the project managers. Usually the project manager and the team, even though the team may not be fully developed yet, at least you know who the key stakeholders and leaders are that you can involve in that process so that you've got that buy-in. And even if we know hypothetically what the right answer is or the best answer is for the organization, that doesn't really matter, we as consultants, because it doesn't matter what we think necessarily. It's what you need to have that buy-in and ownership from the project team, back to what we talked about in the opening sessions around the ownership and what are the roles and responsibilities and how do we control the project, keep it on track. You need that ownership as a starting point to be able to get there. And the output itself is important, but what's arguably just as, if not more important, is not just the output of what the strategy is going to be, and we all agree that this is the strategy, we've made this decision, but what's also important is the strategies we didn't choose, because it creates a certain organizational confidence and alignment knowing that we didn't go down these paths, and here's why. Because inevitably what happens is, let's just say we skip this step. Let's not do that. Let's just go pick a software vendor. And let's just say we happen to get lucky, we pick the right software vendor. That just happens to be the right strategy for us. And we just sort of luck out in that way. Even if that's the case, which rarely happens, but even if that were the case, what will end up happening inevitably is there's some imperfection in that strategy and some risk that people will then start to doubt it, and they'll start to question it, and then they'll start to resist it, and then the whole thing falls apart, not because it wasn't a good strategy, but because the organization didn't see or understand why that was the direction. And so the way to counter that is to say, we looked at these different paths that everyone else or other people might want to go through. Here's why they're not good fits with our strategy. This one is, and that's why we're sticking to this one. And if you haven't gone through that exercise organizationally, it's almost impossible to not resist it, because you're going to find imperfections in the strategy.
That's classically why most organizations, or many organizations, only get to that stage 1 that we were talking about, in terms of the 30 stages of digital transformation, right?
Yeah. So let's talk about a couple other things here I'll mention. I'm going to come back to this slide last because it leads into the implementation readiness piece, so I'm going to skip that for now, but we'll come back and then that'll lead us in. But one thing that we talked about earlier without mentioning it with this exact name was strategic articulation and strategic alignment. How do we ensure that we take the high-level business strategy, which is what you see at the top of the screen here, and how do we break that down into tenets or strategic focus for the digital strategy? And this is oftentimes the first step we need to go through, is really understand the business strategy and set aside digital and technology for a minute and just understand the organization and where it is today, where you're headed, why are you trying to get there, and what is it you want to do within what amount of time. And then ultimately you take that high-level strategy and objectives and you start to break it down into what it means to the digital strategy. For example, tier 1 ERP system versus best of breed. Let's just say those are two, distinct binary paths, when in reality it's not quite that clean, but let's just say that that's an option or a decision we have to make. In order to make that decision, we have to start at the top and then work our way down to understand what is the business trying to accomplish, and then what type of roadmap or what type of strategic direction is going to make the most sense from a digital strategy perspective. And that digital strategy, of course, includes all the things we just talked about. It's not just the type of technology, it's also organizationally, what is it we're going to do to the organization, business process and operations, what is it we want to do there, and really just starting to break it down. And that creates the alignment we need to ensure that our digital strategy reflects what it is we're trying to accomplish. It also removes that headwind or that tension that often happens when you have a strategy that's up here going this direction, and then you've got a digital strategy that goes off in this direction. That creates a lot of tension that makes it almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to succeed in your digital transformation because you're not aligned as a team and as an organization. And it's amazing, to me, when I talk about it, it sounds so simple and it doesn't sound like anything unique or earth-shattering, but it's amazing how many organizations just don't intuitively think to do that. But I think I think conceptually it makes a lot of sense. But the question is then how do we do it? How do we get decisions and alignment around some key decisions? And this slide here, it's a lot for one slide, and it's trying to condense a lot of ideas into one slide. But generally what we do, in addition to that strategic articulation, is then start to make more key fundamental decisions around our business and the digital strategy that is going to support our business going forward. So what you see here, I'll just sort of summarize what you see in the middle here, these two slides in the middle column. This is an example of a client engagement where we looked at current state and future state for one department. This is procurement on the top there, that was for procurement for one location within this organization. And what we did is on the top, all the red dots you see was sort of looking at the executive team and understanding what the current state is in terms of a spectrum of standard processes versus flexible, decentralized processes. So that's a spectrum. It's not an either or. It's a matter of understanding where it is we're going to fall on that spectrum. So we look at the current state of where we are today, and then we look at the future state, and the green is the future state. So this was an executive team of, 7 people, it looks like. 7 people, we got their inputs, quantitative inputs that is somewhat subjective, but they're quantitative inputs that measure where on the spectrum they are today and where they think they want to be in the future. And the reason we do this is partly to see how well aligned we are, both on where we think we are today and where we're going, but also to look at how big of a gap it is between current state and future state. So starting with the first thing, as are we aligned, you can see that even on the current state, this team isn't super aligned. They can't even necessarily unanimously agree on where we are today, which is, I don't want to say it's understandable, it's somewhat surprising, but it's very common to see this with executive teams. You would think that everyone's sort of on the same page, at least with where we are today. Maybe the future state's a little bit less clear, but even in that case, there's some misalignment there, and certainly when you start to define what the future state is, that's even more misaligned. So this tells us we're not aligned yet. That's not helpful on the surface, but at least we can quantify it and see that we're not aligned, and we've got to figure out how to get those clusters close together, at least on the future state, because otherwise we're going to have 7 different views and visions of how this project should go, and it's not going to be successful because you're not, you as an executive team are not on the same page. So, and keep in mind, this is just one tiny decision within a big transformation. This is just one example. There's a lot of different decisions like this that need to be made. And so what we look at it then is, okay, we're not aligned, and we also kind of see that if you look at the green, it's sort of leaning towards the left side of the spectrum, whereas the red is leaning pretty heavy toward the right. Even though they're not aligned, we still see that there's a fairly significant gap between current state and future state, which tells us that's a fairly big jump for this organization. So the procurement department is going to go through probably a fairly significant change. If those green outliers end up shifting over to the left with the rest of the group, it's probably going to be a fairly significant change. In other cases, we do the exercise and there's not a huge change. People don't envision that big of a change to a certain department or function, in which case it's not to say that that change is going to be easy, but it's going to be easier than this case where we have a bigger delta between the two. So this is a way that we, sort of a framework we use to help get that alignment, but it's important to really think about all the decisions that need to be made as part of a digital strategy to ensure that your executives, starting with the executives, get on the same page, and then ultimately there's a lot of decisions that trickle down through the organization that need to be made at the lower levels of the organization. And this is a very, I'd say, diagnostic way of going about it so that we can now put together a digital strategy and also a change management strategy that better reflects exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish. And it's a little bit more surgical, I'd say, because now it allows you to focus where the biggest impacts are and where the biggest changes are, and it allows you to make sure that you define a strategy that addresses this stuff. And then once we've done these sort of exercises around not only the strategic articulation that we talked about on the previous slide, but then the more detailed, granular decision-making we do here, now we can start to define what the path forward is and what the strategy is in the longer term. And by the way, too, in the bottom right corner, this is a risk mitigation framework that is probably impossible to read. I can't read that even standing up here, so I don't expect you to. But it's a risk management framework. We're happy to share it with you if you'd like. But there's 13 different areas and lenses that we analyze risk from throughout a digital transformation. And as part of this decision-making process, that's part of what we're starting to do, too, is identify what the risks are that we've just identified. And again, this gets back to that love and logic thing or example I was giving you earlier, which is now we're putting it on the table of the executives to say, we're not here to say whether or not this path is right or wrong, but we are here to say, here are the strengths and here are the risks of this path that we've just chosen. And that's where you get into the whole negotiation process of, yeah, but can't we just do that without the risk? And we say, no, that's just an inherent risk within what you're doing. It's not a bad thing, it's just a risk, and now we've got to figure out how we're going to mitigate it. And so understanding those risks on the bottom right here becomes a really important input into the overall implementation planning and implementation readiness process that we talk about next.
This internal discovery, too, is really illuminating for the organization, right? You find out exactly where you're going, where you've been. Logan, I'm going to pick on you a little bit because you've just taken your organization through a large part of this. But also documenting it, having some artifacts that support this, reminds everybody all the way through exactly what you agreed to when you were going through these workshops.